3 times. There we go. With that, I will go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Bess Mayer, an event host at Bookbar. As many of you know, Bookbar is an independent bookstore in Denver located on Tennyson Street. We're so excited to be here tonight to host Rebecca Taylor, author of the just published The Secret Next Door, and Carter Wilson to celebrate the launch of the novel. We're honored to host them and hold events like these. As some of you may know, we were briefly able to hold in-person events through the late summer and early fall on our patio, but we've decided to return to virtual events through the winter, in part because of the weather and in part to help keep everyone safe. At Bookbar, we are open for indoor browsing, in-store pickup orders, and ship-to-home orders. We can even offer free delivery by bike to people living in 80211 and 80212 zip codes. Rebecca has very kindly said she will sign some copies at the store. So if you order a copy from Bookbar, and I'll put a link in the chat, and you put in your shopping cart comments, signed copy, we'll make sure to get a signed copy, but that is for local pickup orders only, unfortunately. And we'll do a Q&A at the end. As I mentioned, you can put your comments and questions into the chat box. We'll do it to start about 7:45, and I can help manage, moderate that Q&A. And now I'd like to introduce our authors. Rebecca Taylor spent her 20s working as an international flight attendant while pursuing degrees in psychology and sociology. It wasn't until she was pregnant with her first child and working on her graduate degree in psychology that she began writing fiction. Rebecca has since written 8 novels. Ascendant won the Colorado Book Award in 2014, and Effective Needs was a finalist for the Romance Writers of America Rita Award in 2017. Her Perfect Life was her first work of psychological fiction and was published by Source Books in 2020. She currently lives in sunny Colorado with her family. Carter Wilson is the USA Today and #1 Denver Post bestselling author of multiple critically acclaimed standalone psychological thrillers. He is an ITW Thriller Award finalist, a 4-time winner of the Colorado Book Award, and his novels have received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Library Journal. Carter lives outside of Boulder, Colorado. And Rebecca will start us off with a 5-minute reading from her novel. And with that, I will turn it over to her.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bess. And hello, Carter. Thank you for moderating today, and welcome everybody who came. I really appreciate you guys being here. So I'm just going to do a quick reading, and I'm going to start at chapter 21. And to give you a little bit of a background, essentially the couple, Allison and Justin, have not been speaking to each other for several days, and his mother-in-law has just come into town. So Allison crossed back over the street and up her driveway with Andrew, that's her son, in tow. She was so preoccupied with the news of Carl Whalen's arrest, she had completely forgotten about her miserable mother-in-law waiting, sitting alone at their kitchen table with only a plain glass of water to occupy her. She could tell the moment she entered the kitchen that Renee was annoyed that Allison had been gone for so long. From the disapproving crease between her eyebrows to her downturned lips, Allison felt certain Renee had several snide remarks thought up and ready to fire the moment she was within earshot. Luckily, Andrew's exuberance over seeing his grandmother quickly redirected Renee's attention. "Grandma," he yelled as he ran through the family room and into the kitchen. Renee's expression changed in an instant. A perfect white-toothed smile and bright-eyed excitement swept away her sour face. She stood up from her chair, threw her arms wide, and bent low, ready and happy to take on the full force of Andrew's body hurtling towards her. Allison watched as Renee wrapped her arms possessively around him and lifted him up off the floor. She kissed his cheeks several times and cooed, "Oh, I've missed you so much." She closed her eyes and gave him another big squeeze before planting him back on the floor in front of her. She brushed his long hair away from his face and stood back up to face Allison. "I just got off the phone with Justin," she said. And as if on cue, the door to the garage opened. Surprised by the sound, Allison turned and watched Justin walk into the house hours before he normally would. "Well, speak of the devil himself," Renee said, her current joy subtly doubling down at the sight of her only son. "Hey, Mom," Justin said as he passed Allison in the family room. He gave her a quick glance. "Allison," he acknowledged on a fast exhale before continuing past her and into the kitchen. It was the first and only word she'd heard from him in days. Andrew wrapped his arms around Justin's leg and gazed up at his father, who was leaning in to hug Renee and accept her kiss on his cheek. Allison stood still, watching the scene of reunion and love unfold from her spot in the living room. It didn't involve her, not even a little bit. The only person in the threesome before her who would have wanted to include her was only 5, and he was too busy being sandwiched between his father and grandmother to notice his mother off to the side. Justin tousled Andrew's hair, sending the long locks cascading back into his face. He turned towards Allison. "Since you're not feeling well, I told Mom I'd take her and Andrew out to dinner," he said. "That way we'll be out of your hair and you won't have to worry about cooking," he added. Without any further explanation, he turned back to his mom and Andrew and started to tell them about the restaurant downtown he was taking them to. Justin's words stunned her. She wasn't feeling well? So that's how he was planning to get through this visit, with a lie? On one hand, she was genuinely relieved to not have to spend the next several hours placating Renee, pretending to not notice either her backhanded compliments or the full frontal insults. On the other hand, who the hell did Justin think he was? They'd been fighting for days. Then he waltzed in tonight, announced the terms of the armistice from the safety of his mother's audience, as if Allison could say a single word to contradict him while Renee stood by observing them. Even as the 3 of them collected themselves and got ready to leave, Allison could feel Renee's questioning gaze run between Justin and herself. Her mother-in-law was rude, but she certainly was not stupid. She suspected something was not quite right between them. After Justin's proclamation that Allison was too sick to join them, when she neither looked it nor had said anything herself about not feeling well in the hours prior, Renee's radar would be up. Allison knew her mother-in-law well enough. A connoisseur of other people's business and a master craftsman of gossip, she would certainly weigh their tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, all in an attempt to get to the bottom of a niggling suspicion. Something was not right between her son and his wife. The only question Allison had was, how would Renee feel about that? She had always felt like Renee's dislike of her and thought she wasn't good enough for Justin. But would she really be pleased to see their marriage hanging from the side of a cliff? Especially considering how much Renee loved both Justin and Andrew. Did she really think divorce was the answer to her long-held animosity towards Allison? "Bye, Mom," Andrew yelled as they headed out through the garage door while neither Justin nor Renee bothered to say a word to her. The door slammed behind them. "Bye," Allison whispered into the empty house. She was alone, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of what life might be like if she and Justin continued on this way. It had only been 6 months, but so much had changed between them since moving to Colorado. She stood in the middle of their massive living room, surrounded by all their new furniture, and wondered if the effort they put into this new life was pointless. If their marriage was ending, what would they do with this dream house positioned at the very edge of this dream neighborhood? Who would get it? What would they do with all this furniture and stuff they'd been filling it with? Stuff whose large dollar amount was still reflected on their monthly credit card bills.
Well, that was great. and,
Thanks, Carter.
and thank you for that, Rebecca. And you started out with marital strife and in-laws, and if there's no greater metaphor for this book, it's a connoisseur of other people's business. So I think that was the perfect passage to read. So thank you for that. And I want to take a moment and just acknowledge that your book is born today, and that's a big deal. So get your champagne. I got my wine here. Get your champagne. It is such a big deal to have a book come out, and there's so much process and work and time and hope and luck that goes into everything. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge what a big deal that is. So I'm going to take a sip of my wine.
Thank you, Carter. And thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
So we have a lot to get into here and we don't have a lot of time to do it. And I was very fortunate that I got an early copy of this book and I was able to read it months ago, and I loved it. And there's so much intrigue in it. But before we get to the book, I want to kind of know a little bit more and hear a little bit more about you as a writer. And I interview a lot of writers, and I'm always so curious about the inflection point of when was it you decided I'm going to be a storyteller. And Bess didn't give your whole bio, but I've read your whole bio, and there was a lot of moving going on in your childhood. You went from place to place a lot. So I'm curious, was that informative for you at all? Were you escaping into books because you were jumping from place to place and it was hard to establish friendships?
Oh, Carter, you're just going to go right to therapy here. I
Yes.
see there's
Well, I
no.
know you're a psychology major, and this is kind of what I love to do. I like to get into it.
No, and I actually I'm very open about all that, and the answer is yes. I mean, absolutely. And so for anyone who doesn't know me personally, I grew up in a military family. We moved a lot, and I would say absolutely, like learning how to leave and enter relationships as a child was a big part of just sort of my psychological makeup, you know, growing up. And definitely books were not only, I mean, they were the friendships, but they were also that safe space for me always, you know, just to kind of, and I would escape into books, like literally run away into books kind of thing. So they were a big part of just my development as a human being, you know, growing up. But
What were you reading back then? Like, what do you remember? Like, oh, I loved the Nancy Drew mysteries, or I loved whatever.
No. Yeah, I never got it. I started right
I love
into
The
Judy
Shining.
Blume. I went right into Judy Blume's Forever, I think is one of the first books I remember reading.
Right on. Yeah.
But well, and actually I would say one of the earliest books I really remember hitting me was, of course, Where the Red Fern Grows. And I remember reading that in the back seat of my parents' car. We were on a road trip, and it was like a 1983 Decent, or Knotson Decent. Yeah, here we go. Dotson, yeah. And I'm like in the back seat with my brother and sister over here bawling up against the window, trying to be as like quiet as possible. So that's a very vivid memory.
That's a very heavy book.
Like, a lot of Dean Koontz, Stephen King, a lot of romance before it was probably appropriate for me to be reading those books, you know, kind of thing. So I was full in the genre throes when I was younger, and then I got into probably more the classical literature, started in high school, and then into my college years kind of, you know, did a lot more of the, you know, Shakespeare and the Jane Austen, and, you know, developing that appreciation for the language piece of it. So I really do have a love for a wide spectrum of books. I always say that about me, that I don't think I've met a type of book yet that I don't love. I've read science fiction, I've read Westerns, I've read romance, I've read classic literature. And it really is just, I have a love of the book, and I think it's because they helped raise me.
Right. And I think that's common too. I think with a lot of writers, you don't meet thriller writers who only read thriller books, for example.
Wow.
People are very well read across the spectrum, and you know, I read mostly nonfiction and I write thrillers. So it
don't
just
get me
depends.
started. Don't get me started on the nonfiction. Yeah.
Right. It's just a love of the written word. But you went to college not majoring in English. That wasn't your intention, correct?
Well, I actually started as an English major, and I wasn't certain if I wanted to major in psychology or in English. And I don't know how wise this was or what it says of me, but I do remember actually having this thought of like, I was a little frightened that what I was learning as an English major was going to take away what I loved about reading. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, it was almost like
take the magic away a little bit.
And I really would say that the pull towards psychology at the time for that as a major just kind of captured me more than too. So when it came time to make a decision, like you can only take so many, you know, before you have to kind of focus. And I decided to go with the psychology, and I don't regret that, because I feel like that informs my writing maybe even more so than having been an English major would have. So
for sure, it's an experience that informs how you write, you know, as all of our past experiences are. And you know, not going into writing is not the worst decision in the world as a college major, because you know, there's not a lot of, you know, college classes that teach you how terrible the industry actually is to survive on. So going into psychology probably wasn't a bad idea, but clearly it was always resonant within you, right? There was something in you that's like, okay, you know, there's a difference between wanting to be a storyteller and actually physically sitting down and having the discipline to write page after page and complete a manuscript. So what was that process like? You know, you traveled, you were a flight attendant. uh, and you were, again, part of this whole escapism,
Yeah.
probably that's a thematic within your life.
We're seeing a theme here, right? Yeah.
But that's true. And you kind of write about that a little bit too, just about like this idea of like, it's somebody who wants to kind of have a better life or escape to something that's not within what they're experiencing right then. But what was that transition for you from like, thinking about being a storyteller and actually sitting down at a laptop and starting to type sentences?
So it's interesting because I actually did not grow up, or nor when I was in my early 20s, I think about being a writer. Like I was definitely not one of those people who was, always knew, oh, I was going to be a writer. But I would say largely because I didn't think that that was something that was in the realm of my possibility. Like I was not a person then that was capable of having a dream that big for herself. And that's quite true. Like, and I think when you grow up in certain environments kind of thing, it can be hard to imagine that that's something you can have too someday if you work hard enough and try it. Like really, I was a reader and I admired authors, but it was so far outside of my universe in terms of something that I could ever get to that I didn't even entertain it. And oddly enough, it's funny because like even through like elementary and school, I remember writing stories for class and things like that. And the teachers were always very impressed and they would tell my parents like, wow, this is really good. But it was almost like, oh, good job. You got an A on that. But it didn't mean anything to me in terms of like, oh, maybe I want to be an author when I grow up. And it really wasn't until I was 27 and I was pregnant with my daughter, Beth, that a story idea came to me. And I don't know, I really could not tell you like what was the impetus for me to decide, oh, I'm going to open this laptop and start writing this story. But I did start writing that story. And again, like just without any kind of plan for it. I didn't know enough about the industry. I didn't know anything about the industry, or maybe that there was an industry even. I just started writing this book, and it took me a very long time to write that first book because I would have started writing that in 2002, and I didn't finish that book probably until sometime around 2006. So it was.
So what was it? Yeah, because it's very common. What you're not describing, but what's a real thing amongst writers is imposter syndrome, where you're like, I'm not a writer. I wrote several books, but I'm not a writer because real writers make billions of dollars and this and that. So when you were writing that first book that took you several years, were you telling people about it? That's the other thing about writers. It's almost shameful. You're almost embarrassed by what you're doing.
Well, it was really just such a hobby. I mean, you could not classify it as anything other than a hobby. And it happened so randomly, like it was a hobby I didn't even do very well because I hardly did it, kind of thing. And it wasn't actually until my husband and I moved back to Colorado and I got involved, and some of those members might be here tonight. So I started kind of looking online for like local writing groups and things like that. And that's where I learned about the Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers. I came across their website, and I got involved in one of the critique groups that held meetings on the north side of Denver. And I took that first book, to those critique meetings. And I have a very vivid memory of the very first night. It was like fall of 2005. And I went to the back room of this kind of old used bookstore to meet with, these 6 or 7 other people and read what I had written for the very first time out loud to other people. And I was so terrified and I was so nervous, just even to read it in front of 7 other people, but that was the beginning of my education with regards to the publishing side of,
right.
Even awareness about what that was. So, yeah.
Well, that's pretty brutal that they made you read it as opposed to just sit it ahead of time and critique it, that you have to stand up there and read it in front of everybody. But I mean, that's part of the industry, right? As we've all experienced, that kind of vulnerability is a huge part of it. And having to expose yourself and get the feedback and learn from it and learn from rejection is a big part of that. So what did you take away from all of those experiences as with that book?
I took away the biggest lesson I took away from that book is to start plotting books before you just write them, because it was really hard to edit that book.
I
That
haven't
just
learned
sat
that
down to
lesson
write,
yet.
you know, on a whim, not really knowing what you're doing, and then you have to kind of go back and try to edit that after the fact. And so that taught me a lot about having a plan, or the best kind of plan you can come up with prior to getting started. And I would say that was probably, but the big lesson I took away from that, because I did finish writing that book while I was still with that group, was that I could finish a book.
Right.
Like, that belief that, oh, I have written a book and I have completed a book. And I think, for any people who are, I don't know if there's any new writers, but that is a huge leap, like right there, like going from one side of the fence of I want to write a book to, oh, I did write a book. It doesn't mean necessarily that book will find a home or a publisher or whatever, but just that knowledge that you can write a whole book and complete it is enormous, because then that means you can do it again. And that was big for me.
Right. You're building that muscle, and you're totally right. That's the biggest hurdle for my observations. That's the biggest hurdle for any aspiring writers, physically completing a book and not getting hung up on like, this isn't perfect, or this isn't how I envisioned it. It's because it's like exercise, you do it more and more and more. And you're like, okay, now I know how to do it. And I've built up a tolerance, and I can sit down and physically write and get the words done. And then I can go back and focus on other things. And so were you able to let that book go and release yourself into the next one?
No, I don't let anything go, Carter.
You're tenacious.
No, or stupid.
It's a fine line.
Yeah. No, that was a book I sent out, and I had a couple very near close calls with agents, and unfortunately, I got some positive feedback from it that just kind of reinforced my idea that I shouldn't let it go. But I did self-publish that very first book. And actually, I know there's at least one or two of my old friends in the audience, Lisa's here, I know, who have that book. It's not written under my Rebecca Taylor. It's actually a book I published under a different name. But I do have a couple friends who supported me even way back then, and they bought and read that book. And they said they loved it. They could be lying to me. I don't know. But that was my first foray into self-publishing, back when self-publishing was going to ruin your whole life.
Right.
It's going to ruin your whole career if you self-publish.
So, and then along that path, you've published several other books kind of within different genres. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with what you enjoyed reading. You were all over the board.
Yeah.
What was that like, during that process, were you finding kind of a voice for yourself of like, oh, maybe this is what I want to write? Because eventually, and this could be transitory, but the last two books have been psychological suspense. Did you get to a place where you're like, oh, that's my sweet spot. This is what I love to write?
Well, for years, I was like trying to sort of break into the YA market when YA was hot, right? Remember when it was gangbusters, and I enjoyed writing, those YA books that I wrote when I did. I think the thing that really kind of drove me away from YA and back into adult fiction, and I told a few people this, was when my own children became young adults. And I was like, I just can't. Like I am now the antagonist of their life, right? So I'm like, how am I supposed to write books for teens? Like, when it's going to turn into, a women's fiction novel, because it's going to come from the parents' perspective way too much, sort of thing. So I really kind of got to a point where I just couldn't identify with that market anymore. And I think it's mostly just being the mother of teenagers at the time. And, I didn't have any intentions of dying myself, right? Like they do in all the YA books,
Right.
Sort of like,
Right.
So I couldn't get on board with it anymore. And I actually also, around that time, was when I decided I really wanted to try to give traditional publishing a try again. Mm-hmm. And I knew to do that, I was probably going to really have to, shift gears. And so it was right after I was nominated for the Rita Award for the last YA book I wrote, which was Effective Needs. And went to a conference, and I knew that there was an agent that I wanted to pitch to there. And I just kind of parlayed that nomination into the conversation we had during my pitch appointment. And so she graciously said, it sounds interesting what you're talking about writing, please send me something when you have it ready. Because of course I went and pitched it and I didn't have anything like other than an idea, right? And I knew I wanted to send it to her. And so I wrote the first 4 chapters and I sent her those, and she decided to sign me based on that. So
wow. That's great. And that also underscores the importance of, being part of a writing community. Like with any other business, networking is so important. It's the same as a writer, being part of conferences, being part of pitch fests, networking, getting to know people. You never know what connections or what opportunities are going to come out of it.
absolutely.
So then your first psychological thriller was Her Perfect Life. And what was kind of, the story behind that, or how did that come about?
That really was like, I have this fascination, or like, I love movies and books that are about writers. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It actually doesn't even matter if it's good.
Misery.
Like, yes, I love Misery. And I actually, funny that you say that, because I just watched this, The Secret Window the other day with Johnny Depp, and I cannot get enough of it. And so I was really just kind of one of those things, like I wanted to write a book about an author, right? And then I kind of just, her and her sister has a life that's much more like mine, it's sort of like regular, middle class mom, raising kids or whatever. But I also kind of got hung up on that sibling dynamic, like what happens, when one sibling is really, really like ultra successful, and then the other is maybe living a more like kind of typical life. Like, what must that be? What would that be like? And I would say that was probably the question that was one of the biggest ones behind Her Perfect Life for me, was just kind of exploring that.
So that's where your psychology degree comes into play. And
it comes in handy sometimes.
So now I feel like we kind of have an idea about your evolution, to get to where you are now. So let's talk a little bit about The Secret Next Door. And, also a psychological thriller. And when we think about neighborhoods and we think about our neighbors, everything's changed, right? Even from 10 years ago. Like, it wasn't that long ago that you really didn't know anything about anybody in your neighborhood, except for the people that you chose to become friends with. But now everything's out there if you choose to be a part of that, right? Like, you log on to Nextdoor and you're like, oh, there's some stuff brewing in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
Is that, that insidiousness that clearly compels you? Was that kind of a little bit of a seed behind this book, is like just the idea that everyone's lives aren't that secret?
Yeah, I mean, for sure that, there were so many different things that really kind of came together and found a home, in this book with regards to inspiration. But definitely, so and I think I talked about this. I had a Westward interview, and I sort of briefly talked about this in there, but the Facebook pages, the Nextdoor type stuff. But, really the biggest thing for this book was I was with some girlfriends and we were having some cocktails, and we were talking, we all live in the same neighborhood, and we were talking about our own neighborhood. And we've lived here for a while, and just like some of the crazy things, like, oh my gosh, like you would not believe, like I actually could not write a book about our neighborhood that was based in real life, because nobody would believe it. They would be like, there's no way that much stuff could happen in any one neighborhood. But of course, one of my friends had said, you should write a book. And I'm like, yeah. But of course, it was one of those ideas that wouldn't let go. Like, you're just kind of, it's like, they're like, oh, and how would that work? And what would it be? And then, of course, so many other variables to kind of come into play, because it can't just be about drama. You've got to okay, but what is the personal conflict, for your main characters, and how are they, set against each other? And then it just kind of comes together from there. But there's definitely like little things that inspired it. And I recently wrote a piece for Criminal Element, and actually one of the inspirations was that we had a cold case killer in our neighborhood that was convicted of a crime that happened 30 years ago down in Colorado Springs, and that actually wasn't a huge part of The Secret Next Door, but it was like that one of the little things that I was like, oh my gosh, like, you live in this neighborhood and you live next to this person for all these years, and you just have no idea that this was something that was a part of their past, from so many years ago, and the secrets that people keep, so.
Right. Yeah. Like and it's not and it's very relatable, right? This is very suburban. I mean, Top Golf, that you mentioned in the book. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about, this monstrosity that gets built, which is a big eyesore, but it's very popular. It's a huge point of contention for a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And it's true, like with every neighborhood, like you can close your eyes to it, but if you open them a little bit, you see the good and the bad very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think but you don't really make this black and white. You have somebody like, so your protagonist, Allison, there's a lot of gray to her, right? Yeah. She's got even from your reading that you read, there was a lot of like conflict within her own life, and there's a lot of self-doubt. She thinks it's kind of a grass is going to be greener on the other side kind of a situation, but she is constantly thinking, like, if we were just there, it would be a little bit better, or if we were just there, maybe my relationship would be better with my husband. What was that process like for you, going through it and relating to Allison, as you had so much reality with other parts of the book?
I think, to me, like, whenever you create any character, and I think, particularly your heroine, to me, I always appreciate a character that is complex, like that is not, wholly likable, maybe, you know what I mean? Like, but it's definitely somebody they're like, oh, if you're a reader and you're reading it and it maybe is like, makes you feel a little uncomfortable because maybe you identify with it a little bit more than you would like to admit,
Right.
I appreciate that, because to me, whereas, you could never write a completely true person, like you just could never capture the complexities of any one person. But I do try to, like, I try to make a character gray, right? Like, because I'm not actually particularly interested in reading books where, even your heroine or your hero is, so fantastic, or they only have one minor flaw, type of thing. I am really much more interested in characters who make you think about their lives and why are they making the choices, and that even you as a reader, maybe you're judging them, but you understand why they're doing it, because hopefully the author has given you enough information about their psychological makeup, right? Their psychological background, that you can understand why they're making these choices, even if you don't agree with them or you don't like them, Right. And I think it's much like you do with like your friends, right? Or family, I want somebody to feel about Allison as they would like somebody who is really their friend, and they want the best for them, even if they know too much about them and they see that they are making bad choices, and that they're making these decisions based on the baggage that they're carrying, into this situation. And Allison has baggage. And I like to write characters that have baggage because I believe we as people have a lot of baggage, right? That informs our lives. And it can be just I think it's such a much more interesting kind of dynamic if everybody in the book, can kind of be, trying to work out their own stuff, but so is everybody else, right? So it's right. Kind of, they're going to miss each other and there's going to be conflict there.
Yeah, and you're right, and that is also the most difficult part in my mind of writing a book, is striking that balance between, like, this person is likable, but this person is deeply flawed, and sometimes you lose context for that as you're writing it. So as you go through, like, the editorial process, are you getting feedback saying, like, here she's too much of a downer, or here she's too impermeable? Do you find, like, getting reaction from your editor, getting from beta readers of like, oh, that really helps me?
Yeah, I mean, I think all feedback, is useful. I think it's much more useful to get to a point in your process, or like your own confidence, that what feedback is useful and is applicable, and what's feedback that's just kind of like, I think that's just you. You know what I mean? Like, and I feel the same way about reviews. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I don't think that the super glowing review or the super terrible review, like either one of those are necessarily true. Like the truth is probably somewhere, in between that. But I mostly listen when somebody tells me something's wrong, like this is not working, they're not always able to articulate how to fix it. in a way that's actually going to work, but that, hey, this is not quite right. That is something to be definitely paid attention to, particularly people that are on your team, right? That you are trusting to sort of help shepherd your book,
Right.
into
Right.
something that, readers are gonna want to connect with. So, yeah.
And this book doesn't stray away from darkness, right? You have some very dark scenes in this book. And in particular, you kill off a teenager in this book. Now, as a mother of teens, was that difficult or wonderfully cathartic?
It was because you were here for the first part of the conversation. Yeah. It was actually really hard, and I will tell you, there was that one chapter where Bonnie is outside Elijah's door, kind of thing. It's a very short chapter, and I think I cried the entire time I wrote that, that chapter kind of thing. And it's interesting to write something that is your most horrific nightmare. Like, I don't know, like, and it's interesting you say, like, why, is that a choice? And I think everybody thinks everything's a choice, when you're writing stuff, and sometimes things just kind of come to you as you're writing it, too. And that piece, it was hard to write, but at the same time, I could so identify with the emotion that would be happening, for Bonnie, and of course later on for George, that it's just, to me, like, really heavy emotions tend to be easy to write. I just have to know when to rein it in, like, a little bit of spice, a little bit of something can go a long way, and to not go on and on, for chapters on end. But usually I make myself cry so hard that I can't write it that long anyway. I'm like, that's enough.
Right.
That's enough of that,
But I mean, if it's affecting you when you're writing like that, that usually means you're tapping into something. And I think you're right. I think there's sometimes you don't have a choice, because there are some things that need to happen in order to explain the motivations for certain characters. And sometimes what that is horrific. And
Yeah.
it might not even be something you yourself would want to read, but for some reason you can write it. But it needs to happen in order for the story to be complete. Was there a part of the book or a character in the book that you particularly just, I love writing this voice, I love writing this point of view, or I love writing about this thing? Did that happen with this book?
I don't really remember.
It's all a blur.
Well, it is kind of a blur, but I will also admit that this was a hard book to write, and it was hard to write for a lot of reasons, but I think the biggest one was just simply like writing it during the pandemic, right? And I knew it was something I had to get it like completed, but I found it very difficult to just kind of like focus and write. And I was very unsure about this book. Like, when I finished it, like I didn't really know what had just happened, because I couldn't see the forest for the trees with it when I was done with it. And I think it's just simply because there was so much external noise, with everything else. It was really like, I don't know if I executed, what was the execution on this? I'm not sure. And it wasn't until I gave it to my agent and she read it in like a day and got back to me and was like, oh my God, I love it. And I'm like, really? It was just such a sense of relief, because
Right.
I couldn't say, and usually, like, if I've written something, I kind of know, like, I'm happy with it, I'm not happy with it, but I really could not see the forest for the trees with this one. And I think it was just because there were so many other things going on in my life that.
But I think that's where you move past that imposter syndrome, is at that point right there, where you're going to write that book, whatever the outcome of it is, because it to you, it feels like it's therapy to you to sit there and like every day escape into that story, and you don't have any context for it anymore. You don't know what happened, but you're like, this is something that I need. And that brings me maybe to my last question before we get into some Q&A. You, like me and like a lot of other writers, have other full-time jobs.
Yes.
The writing industry is fairly brutal, and it's very hard to make a full living doing it. How do you balance work life?
Yeah.
Do you have a discipline?
Well, I would say for a number of years, it was a lot more difficult. It has recently gotten easier, and I'll tell you why. But for a number of years, I worked as a school psychologist, And you would think, oh, okay, lovely. You've got all the summers and, Christmas break and things like that to get all this writing done. But it was that particular job, I think teachers in general too, people who work in schools, it's incredibly stressful. And it's just one of those jobs that you never leave. Like it comes home with you every night, every weekend. I would have stacks and stacks of files and things like that. And work I had to do. So it was definitely more difficult. And I really just had to be very, as much as I could, try to find quiet time and space, and particularly when my kids were little. And usually that would be at 4 o'clock in the morning. Like I would get up at 4
Oh,
and I
God.
would write. And it was
terrible.
before my kids woke up, and it was before I had to get ready for school. And that's when I found space, because after work I was just flat. I was just exhausted. Like I could not do anything else. And then in the summers, I could find some space and time, there. But yeah, not maybe as much as people think, sort of interesting. But I did make a pretty hard decision at the end of last school year. And that was not only that I left the school that I was working at, but I left the profession of school psychology.
Oh, wow.
I knew it was time, and it was just a number of things that happened, and stress levels had gotten so just kind of untenable at that point that I left the career. So I do actually have a different full-time job, and it's a regular, a 9 to 5, no summers, no Christmas break type job, but I don't take anything home with me. So I go to work and I do my job, and there it stays. I'm never taking files home with me. It's not the kind of job that you would, be worried about later. So I actually find I have a lot more emotional and just sort of creative headspace. And time is always a factor, but at least now that time is not also competing with responsibilities that just sort of never end. When I walk out of work now, I leave, and that's it, completely. So that's kind of nice, because I do find I have energy to write in the evenings and on weekends. And, if I'm up in the morning, I can write then too. So whereas I actually have less physical time, I have a lot more just emotional space for writing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I think as we all get older, we learn what drives us and what our passions are. And what you determine to be your passion is something that you ultimately don't abandon. And so you're making time for writing, and you're continuing on with that. So it sounds like that's just with you now for the rest of your life. You're a writer, imposter syndrome or no, you're a writer. So
Probably.
Congratulations on the release. And I want to open up the Zoom to any questions we have for the last 15 minutes, but congratulations. I'm really excited for you.
Thank you, Carter.
I'll just reiterate that if you have any questions in the audience, you can put it there in the chat, and then we'll make sure to read it aloud to Rebecca or Carter.
And Rebecca, while we're waiting, I did want to ask you, now that you have freed your mind a little bit with your other work, what's coming next? What can we expect next, writing wise, from you?
Well, you see that bulletin board up there behind me?
Is that your
That's the
is that your Criminal Minds case board up there?
Yeah, that's my current project kind of thing. So.
Oh, very exciting.
I don't know how much to say about it. I never really know how to talk about a book when I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah, well, because it's going to change, so you better
right?
not. It's going to change.
So.
Or somebody's going to steal your idea.
I don't think I'm ever worried about that. I'm more worried about someone going, "What? That sounds like a terrible idea." So, yeah.
I just read an article with Elizabeth Strout, and she said she never discusses her next project because then it takes all the air out of it. But we do have another question in the chat. It says, Bonnie or Allison, is there one character you relate to more? And that's from Anna Venkus.
Is there one I relate to more? I mean, it's really hard. And I will tell you, and I'm honest about this, there's little pieces of me in all of my characters, even Justin, the husband, nobody likes, but, and it's, I don't know. I mean, and there's things I don't like about my characters as well. So I mean, maybe those are the parts I relate to the most, the parts about them I don't like. I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, I probably relate more to Allison, just because I don't know that I could ever live in a McMansion type situation like Bonnie, got herself into, kind of thing. But that's also not true. There's parts of Bonnie where, she talks about coming from a small town and that she did it all herself, and that, her kind of marrying up, as she does in the book, wasn't something that she planned on doing, kind of thing. And I think that early kind of, I can do it all myself kind of, so there's definitely parts of all the characters that I really do kind of draw on from my own emotions and my own sort of thoughts and feelings. So I think it'd be hard to separate and figure out one more than the other. So, yeah.
Kirsten Wenham asks, what are you currently reading and or watching?
Okay, currently reading. I just finished. I should have it in here, but I don't. The Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, which was an advanced reading copy. And I just finished reading that and I loved it. It's basically sort of like a library mystery. And I have 3 other books, including Carter's soon to be released next April book, sitting on my to be read shelf. What's Carter, remind me again the title of your new book?
The New Neighbor.
The New Neighbor. Yeah.
Speaking of neighborhood themes.
Some neighborhood books. Yeah. So I also have Carter's new book it'll be coming out in April on my 2BR pile as well. And what am I watching right now? Oh my gosh, I always think it makes me look so bad when I tell people what I'm watching. So there's the new Project Runway episodes that I just bought. Bravo. I've been watching Project Runway since Project Runway started. It's been, and that doesn't have Heidi Klum and Tim Gunn on it anymore. They're all over on Making the Cut. I watch them there too. So I love watching shows that are about people making things. I've determined like the creative process. And even if I'm not really a big fashionista, at all, person, just take a look at my closet and see all of the pajamas and yoga pants, and you'll know that I'm not a fashion person at all. But I love watching people kind of create out loud the way they can on those shows. And the same reason why I like watching the British baking show and things like that. And I think Angie Hodop is here, and I love it when she posts things on Instagram when she's knitting at the time. I'm like, I need to see more of this, and maybe you should just do a live knitting channel so I can watch you.
Angie is a world-class knitter.
Yeah.
I think we should all acknowledge this.
She is amazing. And I just love watching people create things. I have a girlfriend who makes candles. She invited us over to her house and showed us how to do that. And I love that. I love watching people kind of do their thing. It's really inspiring, whatever that thing is. Other than that, Oak Island just came out with a new season. They're like treasure hunters type thing. So I don't know, silliness stuff that's just kind of enjoyable. So
well, they sound very enjoyable. And there's a question from Jill that's kind of like a follow-up. So I'm going to ask two questions right after another. Do you incorporate multiple personalities from your life into one character? And then Kristen Wenham asks, how do you choose the settings or the location of your books?
So the character one is kind of interesting because I don't think I realize it when I'm doing it. I think sometimes people think you write a book and there's a lot of just really explicit intention upon the characters that you create. Like you just really mapped it out exactly how they're going to be. And it really is such a weirder experience where you're sitting down, and if you can get in the right headspace, you're sort of like watching a movie unfold in your brain, and you're transcribing, at least that's how it works for me, and you're transcribing it on the page as it's happening, like the dialogue, the scene, everything that's happening. And so I think that what happens is like you have these people in your lives that are just kind of, percolating in the back of your head, and like, little aspects of different people just kind of come together to create these, these different characters. But it really is not like I sit down, when you might not believe me because you see this board behind me, but like, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this character trait from this person and this one and mash them together. I think if I tried to do that, it would not work. It would be like Frankenstein on the page, I think there would be bolts and, half sewn arms on people, and it just wouldn't work. So I think it really is more of like an unconscious process of, how people kind of influence you in different ways and come across in your characters. And of course, I think it's always easier for people that know you personally to recognize.
Does that bother you though? Because it always would bug me when someone's like, "Oh, I totally see you in this character." I never wanted that. Do you
No.
then want to feel like I got to go rewrite this person so they
Yeah.
don't sound so much like me?
There was only one time, and I will say it happened with that very first book I ever wrote, and it was really not at all intentional. But the person as they came across on the page, I see this now, like looking back, was so like it so readily apparently was this person from my life. And I really did not see it until they contacted me and they're like, wow, like, that was me. And I was like, oh my God. Like,
Were they
and it was a
flattered or were
very
they pissed
unflattering,
off?
it was a very unflattering portrayal
boy.
of them. And I would never do that to somebody like intentionally. And it was really not until, they pointed that out that I was like, ugh, so I would say it's something I'm maybe more conscious of. Like, I really don't ever want to take somebody from my life and transpose them onto the page, because like I said, I like to try to write characters that are that feel as true as they could be. And that means that there's going to be some kind of not great parts about their personality. And so I'd never want to do that to somebody that I knew or loved, because I just think that would be cruel. Like that's doing them an injustice. And it's also, you could never paint a real person accurately, like you just pick this one thing from their life and you decide to kind of splay that into your book. And I don't know, that's just how I feel about it. I wouldn't do that intentionally to somebody. So I think there was a second part of that question, but I don't remember what it was now.
Yeah, you had a lot more to say, which is great. And it actually reminds me, I don't know how many of you read that article in the New York Times about the short story writer who
Ad Art Friend.
Yep.
Yeah. Ad Art Friend. Yes.
It can happen without realizing, and that's such a good thing to think about.
Yes.
The second question was, how do you choose your settings?
I don't know. I think with this one, I just decided I wanted to write a Denver book. I feel like sometimes like Denver doesn't kind of get, maybe represented much as, kind of, I'm like, if I'm writing a neighborhood book, a suburban book, like why shouldn't it be Denver? As opposed to somewhere else. And I feel like I read neighborhood books about other places like, Alabama, Atlanta, and, it's like, why not Denver kind of thing. And I love Denver, I live Colorado. So maybe it was kind of a nod to that. And then her perfect life, of course, is San Francisco, and she, and Denver is where Aline, flies from to go see her sister. So there you go. My next book is not set in Denver though. So, yeah. So maybe I'll come back.
Have you revealed which suburb of Denver The Secret Next Door is based on?
No, that Westward interview tried really hard to like get out of me.
Well, you can see Topgolf from it, so that narrows it down a little bit.
Right. Well, and that's what my whole, like, I did sort of admit that, in the book, it's extreme golf kind of thing. And I did say that actually that was something that really did happen in our neighborhood, that we almost had a Topgolf facility go into the west of our neighborhood. And it really did create a lot of conflict, in our neighborhood between people. But really that was kind of, the end of it right there. And even I would say the conflict that sort of erupted in the book was not at all what happened in our actual neighborhood, because of course in the book there are people that have, financial things to gain from it. And I don't know any of those people in my real life. So whoever was going to gain financially from that facility going in, by our neighborhood. And we are very middle class around here. We are definitely not these like multi-million-dollar, stakes on the line, but of course you have to kind of, you have to ratchet up, everything when you're writing fiction. So, yeah.
Very interesting. There's a question for you, Carter. If you had a favorite character from The Secret Next Door?
Well, that's a great question. I'd probably have to say Allison, because of the same reasons we were talking about earlier, because sometimes it's hard, and Rebecca, you might have the same feeling, reading, fiction within the mystery suspense thriller genre, because it's very easy to become like too absorbed into it because that's what you're writing. But Allison represented to me somebody who was very imperfect, and I have a huge appreciation for that. And it's such a hard line to balance between somebody who's vulnerable and it's sometimes weak and second guessing, and what agents and editors and publishers would call TSTL, too stupid to live. It's really hard to find that balance, and you want to be right in that sweet spot where you can feel empathetic and relatable to this person, but not frustrated at them. And I thought Allison struck a good balance of doing that. We're like, okay, I know who this person is. And when you can have that kind of moment with a character, it always pays off. So I would definitely say Allison.
Well, we just have a few minutes. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anyone has any burning questions, please feel free to type them into the chat.
So Rebecca, has this lead up and this launch, has it differed from what your last one was?
It was
with Her Perfect Life?
Yeah, it was, I would say, completely different, for a variety of kind of behind the scenes reasons, sort of thing. I would say I'm very appreciative of the marketing team that I had this time, and particularly Miss Anna Venkus has been an amazing member of my team this time around, and I'm very grateful and thankful for her. And she's done a lot of hard work, and we just work really well together. So
great. Yeah, and I'll just share that Rebecca and I share a publisher in Sourcebooks, and a huge shout out to Sourcebooks, which is a tremendous publisher, and their marketing and PR and their editorial teams are top notch. So I'm sure your experience has been the same.
Yeah, it's been pretty wonderful. So
great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll let Bess wrap it up, but I just want to say thanks I'm so excited to be a part of your launch, and I'm so excited for you. And it'll be great to see this thing get out into the wild and just take off. So congratulations.
Thank you, Carter. Thank you for moderating this. It's been wonderful. So yeah. And thank you, Bess, for hosting, and for Bookbar hosting. I really appreciate it. So.
Well, thank you both for doing this event with us, and Rebecca for celebrating your launch with us. We really feel honored, and I put another link to the book in the chat for anyone who has not purchased it yet or who wants a signed copy and lives locally. And thank you all for coming. Bye.
Thank you all. Good night.